Sure, I'm ready.
Okay.
I am also ready.
Hi, and welcome to the Roundtable Podcast. I am your host, Magical Bum. Today we have TheDex and Vulpus, and today we're going to be debating about American citizenship. So I want to ask you, gentlemen, have you decided on whether or not who's going to go first?
Yeah, since I have the affirmative on this, I believe that I will go first.
Okay, that sounds fine to me.
Okay. All right. Cool. So whenever you're ready, TheDex, go ahead. Your time will begin when you do. Just give me a moment to grab my phone to keep track of time. I will ping you at your 1 minute mark. And here we go.
So, like,
Yeah.
one question before we start: is it 5 minutes per round? We said right, or is it three?
It's
It's
5 minutes for sure.
Five. Okay, 5 minutes. All right.
yes, 5 minutes. All right. Your time begins when you do, Dex.
And I'll start now. So, first of all, I would like to thank not only my debate opponent that, like me, now has all the free time in the world because school's out, but also the server for even hosting us to begin with. That being said, I would like to apologize for any coughing that I may have during the debate. And I would also implore all of you in the voice chat right now to go to the Twitch that the debate is being streamed on because it supports the server as a whole. That being said, I would like to go deep into my position, which is I know that allowing hardworking, unskilled immigrants into America does not only benefit the immigrants themselves, but also Americans. See, the first of many benefits of immigration that I will show on the cost of everyday products that we all consume. As source one reads, quote, the benefit of low-skill immigration accrue not only to the employers who benefit from paying lower wages, but also to high-income consumers who benefit off of cheaper childcare, landscaping, and restaurant meals, but also to lower income customers in the form of cheaper and more available food, housing, and Medicare. Workers who can specialize in jobs that require somewhat greater communication and arithmetic skills also benefit, as well as the economy overall. End quote. But this effect is only amplified when you understand that most Americans are not competitors of unskilled immigrants, but rather consumers of the products that unskilled workers help make. As source 2 and 3 says, quote, most Americans are not competitors of low-skilled immigrants, they're actually customers. They buy all kinds of services from them, those being house cleaning services, childcare services, landscaping services, and home construction services. If Americans can spend less on these services, then they have more money in their pocket to spend elsewhere, which means more jobs are created elsewhere in the economy, end quote. The lowering of goods does not only benefit consumers, but benefits everyone overall. When people have more money, they can spend it on other markets as well. And that spending creates jobs in those markets, which then makes more workers, which then they spend more money and create even more jobs. But not only that, but since the company benefits from cheaper labor, they're able to make more stores and expand by making more jobs for more people to buy more and cheaper products. This is why source 4 concludes, quote, through lowering prices of non-traded goods, low-skilled immigration brings positive net benefits to the US economy as a whole, end quote. In fact, we actually have a labor shortage that unskilled immigrants can help fill. Source 5 and Source 6 say this, quote, there are more than 2.1 million open positions for low-skilled workers in March, but only 1.2 million people without college degrees looking for work. That's a nearly 2 jobs available for every unemployed person with nothing more than a high school diploma. In that sense, low skill immigrants are the ones who could contribute the most to the US economy, end quote. That means that unskilled workers couldn't even steal jobs from low skill native workers, they would just fill up the holes. And when you couple that with the fact that according to source 1, 7, and 19, immigrants respond to what the market needs. Quote, Latino and other foreign workers don't have ties to the local community and they haven't invested in property. So they can pick up their bags and leave at any point to wherever they're needed. They are the grease of the wheels of the labor market, as Harvard economist George Boros has put it, end quote. See, when we look at immigration, usually the pro side is just using the sad situation of these unskilled immigrants in order to justify their arrival here. But through my use of studies, I have shown you that immigration can be justified not only with humanitarian arguments, but also economical. This is why most economists agree with me. It is best to allow hard-working, unskilled immigrants into our country. I would like to thank you all for your time and your consideration, and I will post all my sources in voice chat, and I will concede the rest of my time to the rest of the debate.
All right. Thank you, Dex. Vulpus, your first round will begin whenever you do.
All right. Well, let me go ahead and change my settings real quick. So first off, I'd like to just say that it was a pretty good opening statement from Dex. And I would like to open by saying that I believe that low-skill immigration in the U.S. is unbeneficial to the average U.S. citizen for a variety of reasons. I would say it's chiefly because it results in lower wages, it results in higher rent prices, and a tax burden for the average American citizen due to their disproportionate use of welfare. Not to mention, millions of low-skilled jobs will likely be lost to automation in the coming decades. So why should we bring over millions of immigrants and then simply have them partake in future unemployment that we will have to alleviate with welfare? He was saying that there's a lot of positions in which actually need to be filled and there's a demand for labor. But ultimately, I find during this recession that is likely not the case, coupled with the fact that in the future we're going to see a greater lowering in demand for labor. I mean, sectors such as transportation, for instance, with semi-trucks is going to be automated. A lot of retail. Retail is the biggest employer in the United States, and that's also going to be heavily automated, as we see in countries like Japan, where they're already beginning to do that. Not to mention all the complementary jobs around these various sectors. I mean, think about how many small towns and their low-skilled labor depends upon the influx of cash that comes through semi-truck drivers driving through their towns or people going through their towns, right? All these jobs are going to disappear, and they're all low-skilled. They really only require people with a high school degree or people who dropped out of the high school degree in order to do. These are jobs that immigrants are going to be competing with native-born citizens to have. So, I mean, in the future, I don't really think it's really sustainable to bring all these people in. And this also goes into my further reasoning why I believe it's not a good idea to bring in all these low-skilled immigrants. I would say that wages in the U.S., due to unskilled immigration coming from mainly Latin America, in our case, have lowered as much as 3% for every 10% increase in immigrants within that labor market. So for every 10% increase in immigrants coming into a certain area of work, like, say, construction, for instance, you're going to see a 3% drop in wages. And this is according to a Harvard professor named George Borges, who did a study on this matter. This has heavily negatively impacted many low-wage workers who have seen a 5% drop in wages while working high-wage workers' earnings have grown by 40% in the same amount of time. So Dex brought up the fact that, the economy greatly benefits, from the fact that low-skilled workers come in and they do these jobs. And that's because, of course, it lowers wage costs, which brings down costs as a whole for corporations, which makes it so, they can perhaps sell goods for cheaper and they can make higher profit margins, right? Because they don't have to pay their employees as much. But I would say the majority of these economic benefits really only go to employers, and they go to the executives and the corporation itself. Because as you've seen in the past couple of decades, most of the people that have benefited from this, economic increase is really the upper class. Their wages have increased 40%. Yet the middle and lower classes, their wages, if you account for inflation, have actually slightly decreased, even though their productivity has gone way up over the decades. So really, the average citizen is not benefiting from this. The elites, the people who make the big decisions in our country, they're the ones who are truly benefiting. So, yeah, I mean, also, illegals as well actually do have a burden on the taxpayer due to the fact that, a lot of them can't directly apply for welfare, but they still benefit from various programs, right? Like subsidized housing. They still benefit from, like, emergency care at hospitals. Actually, a good portion of Medicaid is reserved for taking care of people who don't have health insurance in hospitals. They use that up. Their kids will often get free meals at schools. I think I saw a study that said about 50% of these low-skilled immigrants actually use welfare services in one way or another, even if they can't say directly apply for food stamps. Not to mention, too, Dex was saying that they help like property values and the like. I believe I heard him say that in his opening statement, but that doesn't make sense to me either because when immigrants come into an area, they often come in large numbers, and oftentimes they're going to increase rent, right? Because they're increasing the demand for places in which to live. Yeah, construction companies can't, at a 1-to-1 ratio, supply housing to these people due to the fact that zoning laws and regulations and needing investment. Actually, the time itself it takes to build houses in a lot of these urban centers and cities simply just can't accommodate all these people at the rate in which they come in. So you have this situation where if you have these immigrants come, they lower people's wages, so they make less money while their employers make more money. Then they have to pay more in rent because there's greater competition for these living spaces. Okay, and simultaneously, they have to foot through a tax burden, a lot of times, their welfare to subsidize them. So I just don't think it's really a good thing for the average citizen. And that would conclude my opening statement.
Very well put. Okay, so that ends round one. Dex, round two for you begins when you do.
Could I get like 40 seconds to prep really quickly?
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Vulpus, you can take this chance to get any jabs in if you want.
I don't know if there's really anything I want to say before he really responds. I didn't say in the opening statement.
That's fine.
Sure thing.
There's actually one thing I would like to bring up while he does prep. You also have to keep in mind, too, a lot of these people send back, I saw a study, it was like $40 billion in total to their home countries. So a lot of this money, too, doesn't really fully circulate in the U.S. economy like it would if a native person would have been doing the job.
Okay, so I'm ready now.
All right, very nice. Yeah, no problem. Thanks for that little input, too, Vulpus. Dex, go ahead and begin when you want for round two.
Sure thing. I would like to start now. So this whole notion that unskilled immigration lowers the wages of natives. Now, economists, this is a basic theory, but economists struggle to find this in the actual world. Like we have two real-world examples of this. We have an example of when Jews en masse fled to Israel. We also have an example of when a lot of Southern American people came over to Florida. In both cases, economists found no real impacts on local wages from these unskilled immigrants. See, and not only that, but you can also look at the plethora of data like we have here, like, quote, the extent to which less educated immigrants compete with and harm their native-born U.S. counterparts has been very heavily debated in economics profession. The overall findings of the literature suggest a quite modest negative impacts. And another one, quote, the unexpectedly small effect of immigration on native wages has generated a long and still unresolved debate in contemporary literature. And as well as, quote, we have found no negative effects on overall wages and employment of native-born workers. Another study finds, quote, I find at current U.S. immigration levels, a 10% increase in the share of low-skilled immigrants in the labor force reduces the wages of other low-skilled native workers by 0.6%. So while this is a theory, right, we don't really see this in the world. And to just hit on the only benefits go to the upper class. Well, this just isn't true, right? So when we have unskilled immigrants making things cheaper, what happens is every single other complementary market also benefits from this. Not only the employers, but also the workers there, right? Because if I have more money, I'm able to pay my workers more. Not only that, but I can now, because other complementary markets have more money, they can also open up more stores for even more workers to join, which makes even more consumers. So it doesn't only benefit the elites. This is why immigration in America's past has made it one of the strongest nations today. Now, to hit on this fiscal cost, I found two really good studies on this. Now, one said, quote, there are both fiscal costs and benefits to federal, state, and local governments, but these generally turn more positive over the long run and across generations. And another study saying, quote, the fiscal impact of unskilled immigrants is small and may be positive or negative depending on the characteristics of migrants. Younger migrants who are employed tend to be net fiscal contributors. So actually, this fiscal notion that there's more of a cost isn't this isn't even necessarily true. If there is a cost, there isn't a big cost. And sometimes, more likely, there's benefits, especially over the long run. And this notion that native wages lower, this isn't really true when you look at the vast academia, because as I cited, like I have like about a document with 6 studies saying this. And then so I mean, I hit on most things. The construction companies, with that, just hitting on that point. So the thing is, they're going to need to make more houses, which are going to employ more people. When these people are employed, they're able to spend into the economy. So this is why when you have more consumers, generally, you're going to benefit immensely, especially if they're working as well and they're being productive as well. And automation, well, yeah, absolutely, we can address this with future policy. However, right now, the academia is unanimous in this, that unskilled immigration is beneficial, right? This is why you see most economists always saying that we should have unskilled immigration. This is why you see businesses calling out for unskilled immigrants. And actually, we did try getting rid of immigration, and we found that it doesn't help. Now, Cesar Chavez was a very left-wing union activist, and what he advocated for was to get rid of low-skilled immigrants, farming workers, because he thought that it lowered wages. However, quote, wage growth for American farm workers actually slowed after Congress canceled the Barcelona, which was a program allowing unskilled immigrants in, because farmers mechanized agriculture and grew less labor-intensive crops rather than paying high wages. So no, we do see, when we do try to do things like this, when we do try to limit the amount of unskilled immigration that we do have, not necessarily limit, but get rid of, we see that actually it creates negative externality. This is why the vast consensus of economists agree that unskilled labor is beneficial to the average American worker. I can see the rest of my time.
Very well. Vulpus, round 2 for you will begin when you do.
All right, I'm going to quickly switch my settings for audio.
Sure thing.
Okay, let me start my timer. Okay, so just to address some of Dex's points, I would like to know, does he acknowledge that housing can't keep at a 1-to-1 ratio to the increase in population from immigration, and therefore increases the cost of living for people, especially in big cities, in regards to how their rent will increase as the demand for housing will increase due to these sudden population booms? Like, for instance, in Los Angeles, I believe I saw a study or an article, I should say, that to simply just buy a bed, and was pretty much like a halfway house or a dormitory, costs around like $800 to $1,000 a month in the other city, which to me is completely ridiculous considering the fact that where I live, I know that can get you a pretty decent 1-bedroom apartment in very small towns. I'm sure $800 to $1,000 a month can get you a house. Maybe it's not the best house, but it's still a house. So I think this is a huge burden for people when they, try to live out their lives, to have to deal with these extremely high rent prices or this cost of living. Not to mention, too, there's this notion that immigrants don't really compete with native people in the same industries. The biggest example of this would be like migrant farm labor, right? Like people go to farms in order to pick, whatever exactly, like say avocados or tomatoes, etc., for a time, and then they move elsewhere. Is an example of an industry dominated by immigrants, and they don't compete with native people in other places. But there's a lot of examples where I believe that they do. For instance, retail jobs in the cities, I'm sure low-skill immigration competes all the time for these people. I've definitely seen immigrants working retail jobs. And construction, this is an industry in which native people would do, but is heavily dominated by low-skill immigrant labor. So they do definitely compete, and they take up spots which other people could have. And also, too, it just intuitively makes sense to me, and it was showcased in this Harvard study that, for every 10% increase in immigrants into a labor market, right, like say construction, it's going to decrease their wages. He observed 3%. Some studies, I saw a Cato Institute study said around 2%. And then too, it makes sense, right? Because you have more people applying for a job, okay, then there's going to be more people that are willing to undercut others, and therefore, as a consequence of this, employers can pay these people less. Now, sure, this maybe can decrease prices for the company due to the fact that they can save costs in wages, right, and in labor. But nevertheless, I don't think this is going to outstrip the fact that their wages themselves will also be heavily affected and stagnated and lowered. I mean, why is it that wages have lowered by around 5% in these decades with inflation, while the upper class has dramatically increased. This doesn't seem like it's being proportionally shared as a rising tide between everyone. It seems like a certain group is disproportionately benefiting from these profits. I mean, just look at Jeff Bezos, for instance. He makes billions and billions and billions of dollars a year. You don't see him sharing this with his employees or with the general populace as much. It seems like a lot of this is definitely going to the top, and it's being enabled by the fact that you're bringing in this huge workforce. So I just don't really agree with that notion. Also, too, I mean, Dex says automation is going to be a future problem, so we don't really have to worry about that currently, right? As of right now, it's a good policy to bring all these people in, but automation, taking millions of jobs is over the horizon. I believe I saw Amazon, for instance, has already developed the prototype technology to have semi-trucks drive themselves and do the shipping. And automation is affecting various industries in radical ways. Self-driving cars are going to be up there. People are going to come up with better technology to manufacture goods and to, for instance, do retailing like self-checkout. And so I think this is a lot more of an immediate of a problem than Dex is making it sound like. And I think this is something we've got to take into consideration right now with the immigrant policies, because why bring over millions of these people just for them 10 years later or 20 years later to become unemployed and then have to be supported by welfare? And this is another thing Dex is seemingly ignoring. I think he needs to address the fact that I think it was around 50%. I have a link here showcasing use welfare in some way, and this is a burden that the taxpayer has to pay that Native people don't do it, take up at the same rates. So I wonder as well, I mean, does that make it really worth it? I mean, having stuff $1 cheaper at Walmart, does that outstrip people having to pay hundreds of dollars more a month for rent, not having their wages increase, and then simultaneously, having to pay tax money in order to support these people lives, through subsidizing with things like free meals and subsidized housing? I would say it wouldn't be that case. And he's saying too, they actually are a net employer because a lot of them establish businesses. But I really do question, do they employ more people once they come over and establish all these businesses than the jobs that they take up and compete for? I find that a little bit hard to believe. And that would conclude my time.
Very nice. Okay, cool. All right, so that ends your second round. Dex, your third round begins when you do.
Could I get just 20 seconds really quickly?
Sure, yeah. I guess I'll take this opportunity right now to do some self-promotion. I don't believe I did it at the beginning because we had some, recording issues. So you can find us at the Roundtable Discord by Googling Roundtable Discord. Check out our YouTube page. Our link to the server is there. You can also check out our Twitch stream. We're streaming live right now. And our link to the server is there too. Please join us. We want to hear from you. Right. Dex, are you ready now?
Yes, sir.
All right.
Okay.
Your time begins when you do.
Sure thing. Just setting up my timer. Okay. So a lot of things to address here. So his question to me was, do you acknowledge that there could be negative housing externalities? Yeah, sure. However, this goes into a litany of laws, such as, as you said yourself, zoning and other types of regulatory measures, right? So just because a policy can have some negative aspects to it does not mean we should remove the policy entirely. Because we see through the lowering of costs and the developing of industry, we see that unskilled immigration is a massive benefit to the average American worker. This is why not only Americans are for this, but also economists themselves. So I would say that we need to address these zoning laws. We need to address these market incentives, not throw out the baby with the bathwater. And he also brought up this point that in Los Angeles, it costs so much to live in a one-bedroom apartment. Well, there's a lot that goes into that. Like, for example, if it's if we have a lot of industry there, places are going to be more expensive, land is going to be more expensive. This is gentrification 101. This is not the cause of unskilled immigration by itself. This is the cause of naturally flowing capitalism. This is just how it works. Places get gentrified. It just is what it is. Now, retail jobs, immigrants need to compete. Well, even if this was true, which it definitely, I haven't looked at any studies yet. I'm going to guess is not really that true. we don't see an impact in wages. To quote a few studies, quote, the unexpectedly small effect of immigration on native wages has generated a long and still unresolved debate in contemporary literature. Quote, in another study, quote, there are both fiscal costs. Oh, this is the wrong one. But like you see throughout the literature that there's not this big impact on native workers. Like you also see historical examples of this, of when Jews massively left Russia and went to Israel, we didn't see a huge impact on native wages. When a lot of Southern Americans went over to Florida and increased the labor by 7%, we didn't see these impacts. So, see, he also went on this point that intuitively it might make sense. Well, yeah, maybe, but that doesn't make it true. Just because I see an Earth and it looks flat, it's not true. The same goes with this. We see throughout the vast majority of literature that there is barely an impact on native workers. Again, like many studies have cited that it's generating a large debate because our models on how we view unskilled immigration affecting unskilled workers is not correct. It does not fit what we think it fitted. Now look at Jeff Bezos. So now this is a different thing, right? So just because rich people benefit from something does not mean a poor person does not benefit. As studies that I've cited said before, unskilled workers benefit not only through the consumption of other goods, but also through the generation of industry. It opens up more jobs for more workers, for more consumers to operate in our economy. Now, automation, we should consider this. I absolutely agree with, right? But the thing is, right now, it is beneficial to have unskilled immigration, right? My whole point is that we should have regulated unskilled immigration, not open borders. So we should look at the data concerning this. But again, most economists agree with me that unskilled immigration is beneficial. Now, to hit on his fiscal impact, again, to quote the two studies I quoted last time, quote, there are both fiscal costs and benefits to federal, state, and local governments, but these generally turn more positive over the long run across generations. And another study saying, quote, the fiscal impact of unskilled immigration is small and may be positive or negative, depending on the characteristics of migrants. Younger migrants who are employed tend to be net fiscal contributors. So then again, his two main points that wages are depressed. Well, we don't really see this in the literature. There's a huge debate on whether this is even true for native workers. And his fiscal point, well, this isn't even true in itself because as we see, it's more of neutral when it's in the short run, but in the long run, it's typically beneficial. So again, to reiterate my points, it is beneficial for the average American worker. And I want to ask Vulpus, why haven't we seen these predicted impacts in places like Israel or Florida? And why, when we did try banning unskilled immigration, it has actually affected us for the negative? And I will continue the rest of my time.
Just in time, actually. Let me just close off my... Stop this. Why doesn't it shut up? Oh, there we go. I had to push to dismiss. Sorry, I don't use my phone very often. But here we go, guys. Vulpus, your third round will begin when you do.
All right, give me a second. I got to change my settings.
Sure thing. There will be, after the debates, I will be putting 2 straw polls for who won the debates and is unskilled immigration beneficial to the average American? Yes or no? Just let me get your opinions, and we'll get that. And after we have the straw poll and finish the debate, we'll open it up to the floor. So, Vulpus, if you're ready, you can go ahead and begin whenever you want.
Okay. So one thing I'd like to do is Dex asked me, why is it that we don't see wages stagnate heavily, like we did with, for instance, when the hundreds of thousands of Cubans came over into Florida, or for instance, when the Jewish people exodus from Russia into Israel. And I would say that in Florida, from the studies that I've seen, it definitely, it does affect them. I think it affects everyone within the U.S., at least my example pieces and what I've looked at in the research. Now, in the case of Israel, I'm not exactly certain, to be honest, because I did not look into that specific example. But here's another point I'd like to bring up that Dex didn't quite address that I think he should in his third round, and that is the fact that a lot of these low-skilled immigrants wind up becoming dependent on welfare in various ways. For instance, a lot of them are illegal, so they can't, directly apply for things like food stamps, for instance. But they still benefit from like subsidized housing, or say their kids go to school, they get a free lunch, or say they go to the hospital without health insurance, and then the hospital has to treat them, and then subsequently there actually is a portion of Medicaid that I've read that covers instances like this up to a certain amount. So, this is a burden on communities, and this is a burden on the taxpayer ultimately. For instance, I know a hospital near where I live where they lost their cardiologist and the hospital is going bankrupt as a consequence of a large amount of Latin American immigration to the area, where these people go to the hospital and then they get treated and they don't pay. And then as a consequence, it can't remain profitable. So the doctors and expertise leaves and the community degradates in that way. So I would like to hear some information or response about that. And the studies I've seen, it's about 50% utilize it. Not to mention, too, a lot of them could have native-born children, and they could directly apply and benefit from healthcare, for instance, like food stamps. Not to mention, too, in some states, I believe I've read it was like about 24 or more of the lower liberal Democratic states, they even can apply for these programs as well. And then here's actually another point that is yet to be brought up that I don't really want to spend too much time on, but I think it definitely should be discussed, is the cultural argument. So when you bring all these immigrants over, it's ultimately going to change the host culture, and it's going to diversify both linguistically, ethnically, maybe religiously. And that is a change that we have to ask ourselves as a country whether or not we desire, right? Because as we see right now with riots going on in the U.S. or in various places that are more diverse, it ultimately will increase instability in those communities. You don't see race riots, for instance, happen, in Budapest or in Warsaw, Poland, right, where they're very homogenous. So, that also needs to be something I think that, deserves being addressed and discussed. And also, too, with housing, that's still a great problem that happens. And, automation, I think, is going to happen very soon. And also be a problem where, all these people are going to become unemployed and also, be even more of a potential tax burden than they already are. Dex makes it sound like, this is a far-off problem and that, we should still continue to bring over these immigrants due to our, immediate concerns. But, to say, I'm going to start a fire at my house because I have to stay warm, but not consider the fact that in the, upcoming hours it may start the whole house on fire and burn it all down and be a much bigger problem than the problem that's solved in that immediate moment, right? So I think, to say we should bring over all these people because it may be beneficiary in XYZ ways, which these ways I don't even fully agree with Dex, or really at all, while ignoring how big of a disaster it's likely going to become, I think is a bit naive and not really the proper thing in which to do. Because the ultimate burden it's going to be is just going to completely outweigh whatever benefits that he's stating. Another matter I would also like to address that also hasn't really been talked about a lot is the fact that less of their money really circulates in the U.S. economy as well. I remember reading in one of my sources that tens of percent of the GDP of some Latin American countries like Honduras or Guatemala or even Mexico to a large extent is actually made up by people sending money home from jobs they have within the U.S. So, too, how does Dex address all this money that's leaving our economy and going to these foreign countries? Money that would otherwise be circulating within our own economy. So, how is that beneficial to the average American citizen? How's that beneficial to the country to have all this income? I remember reading it was between $50 and $60 billion a year. Just leave the country. I don't see how that's beneficial. And also, too, he says he has all these studies that showcase that wages don't stagnate, and even though, intuitively that makes sense, that's not the case. Well, I have my own studies as well that show the exact opposite. So, I have my studies, he has his studies. And therefore, as a consequence of all these things combined, I just still don't think it's a good idea. Anyway, that is my time. So let's see what Dex has to say.
Very nice. That ends round 3, which brings us to closing statements. Dex, you have 2 minutes to wrap up your thoughts.
Good thing I took notes because I had no idea we were doing closing statements. But sure thing. So he repeatedly brings up immigration. We aren't talking about illegal immigration. We're talking about unskilled immigration. Now, to continue, see, this whole automation point, now still unskilled labor, we can regulate, right? But we shouldn't have zero coming in, especially when we have a major labor shortage in which we have twice the amount of people looking for work than there are jobs. We have way more jobs than we have people looking for work. Now, this whole burden notion, it is not a burden. I've cited two studies repeatedly. Quote, there are both fiscal costs and benefits to the federal and state and local governments, but these generally turn over more positive over the long run across generations. And the fiscal impact of unskilled immigrants is small and may be positive or negative depending on the characteristics of the migrants. Again, like I'm addressing all of these points. Now, the riots, these were, I mean, come on, dude. Like if you go in the video and you look at these riots, these are by white people. And in fact, most people actually like immigration. Now, if you go in my source, most people, about, I'm pretty sure 60% appreciate and think that immigrants make America a strong place. Now, there's less money to circulate. Well, we don't even need this money to necessarily circulate, right? Because we have so much benefits go to not only the employer but the consumers. Now, these consumers can now spend in other markets and create more jobs. These industry leaders can now make more industries for more jobs for our Americans. Plus, they're going to spend most money here. I mean, they need to live here, right? So they need a house, they need to buy food, they probably need to buy a car as well. They need to buy all these things. Now, you see this whole notion that I have my own studies. Well, I have the vast majority. See, this is why academics have been debating this, is because they don't see the effects that you claim that there is. And I will concede the rest of my time.
Very nice. Vulpus, your closing statements begin when you do. You have 2 minutes.
Okay, let me start my timer. Okay, I'm ready to begin. So ultimately, I would say that low-skill immigration, whether, and also too, he says that we're not talking about legal immigration. Well, a lot of illegal people that come over are tolerated and supported by various policymakers. So I definitely think it's fair to take in consideration them coming over when many people want to make them citizens, have all these programs to give them citizenship, not to mention tolerate it and encourage it. So I definitely think they are part of the equation. But I would just like to say, all this low-skill immigration, whether it's legal or illegal, I think in the numbers it's currently happening, or really in general, it's just not worth it because of, like I said, a couple factors. One, even though DEX has many studies that disagree with this, I have my own studies that do agree with it. I believe it does lower wages and suppresses them. So people are not making as much money or receiving as much in benefits as they could otherwise be receiving if there was less competition. You see this, I saw this phenomenon also actually happen even during the Middle Ages, right? When the Black Plague killed off, millions of people, there was less people be able to work, and therefore as a consequence, human labor was more valuable, so they actually had to pay these people more and treat them better to get their labor. So I mean, the same thing's happening even today. Well, it happened back there. Another reason too, I would say, that I think Dex even agreed with was the fact that it increases rent and housing prices, simply because of the fact that housing just can't keep up at the same pace as people move into these areas as they immigrate. Another reason is the fact that we do have to support the welfare programs. Dex didn't deny that. All right, 50% of them do take up various forms of welfare. That is a burden on the taxpayer. Another reason, a lot of this money does leave the country in huge droves. I mean, 50 to 60 billion is nothing really to scoff at and be like, oh, it doesn't really matter. Again, another reason is because in the future, we're going to have mass amount of automation, and that's going to make millions and millions of these low-skilled workers unemployed and undesirable, and we're going to have to support them even more than we already do. So I don't think the short-term gains are worth the long-term costs. So that would conclude my closing statement. Oh, and by the way, also, like I said, you have to take into consideration the cultural factors as well, and how much is it worth it in that sense too. What type of nation do you want to end up having in the end? So anyway, that concludes it.
That does include your time. And that also concludes the debates. I'll ask our live audience to go ahead and head over to the rec room, or I'm sorry, the recorded events, and take a look at our straw polls. There's 2 of them. Who won the debates, in your opinion? And what's your opinion on unskilled labor and their effects with the American citizen? So at this point, I would like to open up the floor to any of our audience members who have questions, comments, or concerns. If not, you guys could continue your discourse.
Yeah, I have a question for Dax. It would seem to me that the crux of the opposition is something that is not addressed by your studies, and that's fine. But my question is, in an optimal world, if you had resources, so on and so forth, to quantify these cultural costs, how would you go about doing that? How would you address the claim with the academy using research how would you address the claim that there are cultural factors which represent costs which are not included in the study of your sources?
I think you would definitely have to find a way to measure that. I don't know how you would measure that. That would be up to sociologists. But even at that, I mean, there's this whole culture point. I mean, you see that there's still a decrease in crime, so it's not like they're committing all these crimes. So I don't even think it's a problem to begin with.
All right. Do we have any more questions? How about any last minute jabs, Vulpus or Dex?
If I could ask that same question to the against side, how would you go about quantifying these cultural costs?
Hold on, let me change my audio real quick so I can answer that. Sorry, the reason why I do that, by the way, to change it from push to talk and back, because I don't want to have you guys listen to me hit my mechanical keyboard. But how would I address it? I don't know. I mean, a lot of that would have to be done through public discourse and people trying to reason through and rationalize whether or not they would like to see their country change culturally. I mean, there's the aesthetic, subjective opinions, right, where people wonder okay, do I want my country to look more Latin American? Do I want it to look more Mexican? Do I want to go towards that direction more and more? Do I want my communities to shift away from the way they were 50 years ago culturally? And that's a subjective opinion that I definitely think is still valid, even though it is subjective, because people are part of this country. They decide things through democracy, and so those things have to come into consideration, because ultimately we're making policies and decisions based on what the people desire. So another thing too is okay, what are the crime statistics of these various communities? How do they operate? Dex said that they usually have lower crime. They don't really commit as much crime as native citizens. I'm not fully certain on that. I think it kind of depends on the immigrant group, because some cultures, I think, tend to be more violent, engaged in gang activity more than others, right? I think there's going to be a vast difference between bringing over, say, low-skilled immigration from India, low-skilled immigration from the Philippines, low-skilled immigration from Nigeria, low-skilled immigration from Mexico, right? There's such vast different cultural groups. I'm sure they're going to operate and respond in an American environment, depending upon especially too how they're brought over or what ratios, differently. Some worse or better than others. So, and also too, Dex saying, I suppose experts and say sociology would have to look into it and see what effects are transpiring. You can also just look too at the quality of the neighborhoods. What happens, property values, for instance, when these people come in. What are the communities where these people move into? How do they feel about the situation? I suppose you could conduct polling about these matters in such places where it's experienced. So yeah, there's all these variety of ways to do it, but it is a bit difficult, right? Because it's not as cut and dry or mathematical. Say is okay, our wages going up and down, or is rent going up? So it's a bit more complex, but I definitely think there's ways you could do it.
And I just want to tag onto that, and I think it is very hard. And it also, if we do figure something like this out, it's hard to know how to quantify that. See, what I would say to anyone who's very anti-immigration or very pro-immigration is I would say show your support or your unsupport of immigration by voting. Participate in your local politics, vote for your senators, and see who supports immigration and who doesn't, and then have that be the metric of how much the community supports it.
Another thing too, I would also say, even though it is misfortune, and you can say a lot of this is due to racism or people being ignorant, I think it is still a valid fact that has to be considered. The more a country diversifies, linguistically, ethnically, culturally, religiously, it does increase a country's instability, because you have communities rubbing up against each other that may not potentially get along or really like each other all that much, and that's a conflict you have to take into consideration. And maybe you have to take in mind, how many are you bringing over at once? How gradual of a change is this? Is it maybe too sudden for people? Is it happening at a slow enough pace where it can be absorbed and people adjust to the matter, right? And okay, for instance, Irish immigration. When the Irish people came over in the 1800s at first, everyone would really despise them. They rubbed up against them in a very ignorant way or rough way. People wouldn't hire Irish people. But nowadays, no one's going to give you shit for being Irish. No one cares. It's perfectly fine. And, I'm sure many immigrant groups of today will end up having a similar experience in the future where no one even cares. It's just taken for granted they're part of the community. But, simultaneously, you maybe want to keep in mind that it shouldn't happen at too fast of a rate or happen too suddenly, because if it happens at too great of a speed, perhaps it's just too much for people to absorb. And two, you have to keep in mind as well, if you bring over a bunch of people too much at once, perhaps they're not going to be able to assimilate into, become a part of the culture, because if they come in big, large droves, they're going to be able to make their own immigrant enclaves, and therefore, as a consequence, isolate themselves and not, integrate with the community and become a part of it, but instead separate themselves and cause tension. I mean, there's a reason why, for instance, Denmark, with their immigrants from the Middle East, they actually mandated that they'd be spread out amongst the communities and not live in these, immigrant ghettos or immigrant communities, due to the fact that, like I described, they're just not going to assimilate as well in those communities.
And just to touch up on that point, yeah, of course we need to consider this, right? See, my whole notion isn't that unskilled immigration isn't beneficial. My notion that it is beneficial. However, that doesn't mean I want all the unskilled immigrants in the world to come in, right? So I agree with this. We do have to limit the amount that come in. But what's not contested at all, at least by any academics, by any measure, is that it is massively beneficial. For not only the immigrants themselves, but for the natives. So yeah, I do agree with your concerns of how many immigrants should come in. I absolutely recognize that as a problem and as a obstacle we need to rectify. However, that doesn't take away that immigrants are beneficial to American society.
I mean, we could have the debate over again. I could be like, no, I don't agree, but yeah, no, I don't agree, because like you said. Increasing the economy and it maybe making products cheaper, I just still don't think outweighs the fact that, you have to, a lot of these people take up welfare resources, a lot of them are going to increase property prices and rent, which is going to make it harder for people, especially low income, to live. It's like a lot of these people only make $20,000 to $40,000 a year on their own. So, I mean, having a huge increase in rent, having to pay like $800, $1,000 plus rent a month, I mean, is a huge burden to these people. It's really effective. And two,
Oh no, I thought you were done, so I was gonna.
Oh, okay.
I don't mean to be rude.
I do like the point that you brought up about how much money actually leaves the country, going back to the countries they're from.
Yeah, that definitely happens. I mean, I saw that over 10% of some of these countries' GDP is made up by money that is sent home to these countries, to these people's families, and this is money. Like, I have one of my studies here, one of the links I posted, is like between $50 and $60 billion. I mean, imagine the difference $50 to $60 billion makes in the country.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I was just gonna, just a real, comment, anecdotal comment. Growing up in Southern California, I've been surrounded mostly around Hispanics, and I can't tell you how many times, I've had conversations with different people who have family back in Mexico. Even my ex-wife. And her stepfather was actually, he was on a green card. But there's so many people would just send back money to their families. I used to not even believe it. I was like, here we go, another pious person pretending to send money back to their parents, because it happened so often, or not to their parents, but to their family in general. So it is very interesting.
And just to touch up on a few points, so yeah, immigrants could possibly use these welfare services at higher rates. However, we just don't see that in the fiscal receipts, right? To quote some studies, there are both fiscal costs and benefits to federal, state, and local governments, right? We see that in the broad scheme of things, that these even if it is true, there's not much of a big impact. And when you do look at all these things overall, the research is clear. It is beneficial to Americans. But I do think automation is a good point, and I would like to look into that further. It just seems like it's so weird that all these businesses are calling out. They're saying they're needing unskilled immigration. They're talking to legislators about this, and not only that, but economists. Jesus, I can't talk. So economists even are asking for more immigration. So I think automation is a point that we do need to consider. However, right now, we see businesses needing these immigrants as we see these labor shortages.
Well, I think a lot of the reason why, these corporations would be appealing for more immigrants is kind of due to two reasons. I think one is because in the immediate term, it is beneficial for them, because they can lower the amount they have to pay workers, right? They get a sudden influx of workers, okay? And that's going to save the money in the bottom line. It's I don't have to give as much benefits or pay to these people. Therefore, they can come into these jobs, I save money, I become more profitable, the shares grow. But I don't think these same people are going to be sitting down and thinking oh, damn, what are going to be the affect 10 years from now, 20 years now for the entirety of the country, bring all these people over. No, most employers and executives are not going to think that large scale, what's for the greater good or what's going to be good in the long term. They're just going to think, oh shit, how do I bring up profits this quarter? I don't think these people are going to look that far ahead.
And I agree with you, absolutely. That's why I think it's even more important that economists are on board, and they are on board. They do say that overall we are going to benefit from this. So if it was just business leaders, yes, absolutely. Like, we need to look at this with heavy criticism. But we've had, right? We looked at the studies on how wages are impacted, and it's basically null. We looked at how it fiscally impacts us, and it's also basically null. We looked at how it impacted the cost of consumer goods, and it decreases, right? So I would agree with you. However, even economists who do factor in the longer term are saying that this is a beneficial thing.
I don't know. I mean, I think there's kind of a couple reasons to that. I think one thing is it's not all economists. I mean, I found some economists who would actually disagree with this matter, and they would agree that it hurts the average American consumer. But even I have one example I have from a Harvard professor, George Borges. He agrees, okay, yeah, it does lower wages, in his opinion. Yeah, it does bring up rent prices. But simultaneously, he would also say that it does overall benefit the economy, right? It increases GDP, it increases corporate profitability. But he would say that it just simply, this isn't seen by the average American citizen. It's seen by the corporation itself, and it's seen by the employers and executives within it. It's seen by the upper class individuals of the society. It's not seen by the middle and lower class. They have to compete for jobs, have their wages stagnate, have to pay more rent, have to pay taxes and support these people through welfare, have to, have all this money leave the country. They don't seem to be the ones benefiting, even if the country's economy, quote unquote, is benefiting.
See, you can say that wages are impacted, but we see the vast amount of literature. Economists are debating whether this impact is even a real thing. When we look at real world examples, such as the Israelites, not the Israelites, but Jewish people leaving Russia, and as well as Southern Americans coming to Florida, we just don't see these impacts, right? So this was an old theory that needs to be adapted to what the actual world is saying, which is that there is no impact on the wages. And that this notion that it only benefits the elites, this is not really true, because we look at not just rich people aren't the only people who buy things. It's also lower income workers as well, and we see that for them products are lowered, and we also see that because of that, other complementary markets can open up more jobs for more workers who could spend more money, who invest in the economy, and it becomes a nice little circle in which we keep on helping each other. So again, you can't these are valid criticisms in theory. However, in practice, we just don't see this to be the case. But I think your point, I'm not going to lie, your point on automation caught me so off guard. I was typing in my rebuttal, I was like, oh shit, this is actually a good argument. I had to type out. That's why I couldn't. But I think it's definitely something to look into. But I don't think this dismisses all unskilled immigration. I think we should lessen it. And pretty sure I was looking at some studies that unskilled immigrants our children are more likely to achieve higher education. I don't know if this is 100% true. I need to look back at the data, but even at that, it would still benefit us. You know what I mean? So, but I'm not gonna lie, that point had me so off guard. I was so scared with addressing that. I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it just seems like a factor that's going to just make it so undesirable in the future and make it seem like a long-term negative thing for the country on its own. I mean, you throw out everything else, just the fact that automation is going to make millions unemployed, right? And all these people are going to come over just in the future and have nothing to do. I think it just would be a detrimental thing and ultimately a negative thing in the end. And that their kids end up becoming high-skilled workers, I don't know if that's... I find that kind of hard to believe because of the fact that these people are going to be at such a disadvantaged position for a variety of reasons. Suddenly their kids are going to be in a good spot to go to college. I think, in fact, it wasn't there studies that showcased that actually people from these immigrant backgrounds, in Latin American communities, actually have way lower education levels on average than say white Americans who have been here for generations.
But I do also think that so I think we could do what all your criticisms that you have I think are valid. However, we can address them by using policy itself, right? We could say okay, unskilled immigrants can work here for 4 years, and when automation hits in, you got to leave, right? So all of your problems that you're addressing, I think some of them which are valid. However, with policy, when we make policies, what we're looking for is a benefit that can't be reproduced and consequences that can be getting rid of, right? So the benefit of unskilled immigration can't really be reproduced unless you force your population to follow each other. But other than that, they can't really be reproduced. However, the consequences that come with them can be. And I think it's important to look at that. I think it's important to understand that there's massive benefits here, but the only negatives can be supplemented and can be eliminated.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, all the negatives that are associated with it, and all the additional legislation that need to be done. Like, for instance, make it a lot easier for people to build housing. For instance, by laxing zoning laws, laxing regulations. Doing things like, okay, after so many years, you have to leave, an automation kicks in. I feel like it's going to be really hard to actually execute, especially on local levels. Not to mention too, like how many people are really going to want to come, especially when we have such a hard problem with legal immigration as this. How many people are going to want to come for only a couple years, do migrant farm labor for like not even $10 an hour, and then be told, okay, motherfucker, pack your bags, gotta go home. I mean, I don't really see that being executed very well, in all honesty, or working out entirely. Especially when a lot of people culturally just wouldn't even like the idea because they find it to be mean spirited, on the liberal end of things, when they already believe that a lot of these people should remain as it is. So I don't know. There's all these different burdens that come into this policy. It feels like it'd just be a lot easier to just say, no, we don't need hardly any really unskilled immigration to come in because we have enough people as it is who are unemployed, especially now the recession's coming due to the COVID situation. We just don't need all these people. So let's get rid of the illegal immigrants that we have, and let's not bring them in, and let's just have our own people do these works. And if corporations have a hard time finding people to do these jobs, maybe instead of paying people $6 an hour to work their ass off on the field, or $7 an hour, $8 an hour, maybe they should increase the pay, and maybe they should give some benefits, and people would actually come and do it. Instead of essentially using these people like slave labor.
I think that's a good point, Dex, if you'd like to say something, but I believe we should wrap it up here because we're getting into the realm of speculation. And that would actually be a really interesting conversation for another day to be had, the effects of automation on the world to come. So if you have anything else you guys would like to say, I'm going to wrap it up here.
Sure thing. So I want to get a few criticisms and then a few compliments as well. So now, how many people are going to want to stay? I absolutely agree with you. When I first look at how we see policy like this, I examine this first. But we see this in Singapore. They have a unskilled worker program, just as the way in which I described it, in which they can come over and then they can leave. So, and we can force them to leave. So the reason why people come over is because it makes so much more money over here. It's so much more beneficial. And we see it do it. We can make policies in which people come and then they leave. Now, this whole notion that we have enough people, well, that just isn't true. There's twice as many jobs open than the people who can actually take these jobs. So the thing is, we need more workers, especially after something with COVID. Immigrants help jumpstart an economy. So when we can produce so many things, there's so many things are going to be consumed, opening up more industries. If anything, it would benefit us. But also, I agree with your zoning laws. Yeah, it's like the whole house argument. I think it's more dependent upon zoning laws than unskilled immigrants themselves, because we really this is coming from a liberal. This is coming from a socialist. We need to lax our regulations 100% because we're not allowing the market to function in which it's supposed to be. Now, of course, after these criticisms, I do want to give you a lot of compliments. I don't know if this is your first debate. I think you did extremely well. I think it was a very fun, one of the hardest debates I've ever had, for sure. And the automation argument, again, it was a very good argument. I love how you analyzed, and you know what I mean, how you looked at that as well. And your housing arguments, I think all of your arguments share the same theme in that they're very creative. And I admire this because I'm a very analytical person. So I do appreciate your input for sure.
Oh, thank you, Dex. And I also appreciate, too, I mean, you did a lot more research, it seems like, than me. I only had, 10 links, and it seems like you have 25. So, I mean, you definitely were really well prepared for this. And I would also agree, too. I mean, yeah, they do definitely benefit the economy. It's just a question of, who do they really benefit in the end in that economy while they benefit the economy as a whole. And, I should read more about your positions and, maybe see if there's some points in which I could budge on and agree with, and others I couldn't. I think we could maybe come up with a little bit of a synthesis, I suppose, between us. on what the good amount of immigration is, or in what ways it does or doesn't benefit, and how we can help these problems out.
Well said, gentlemen. I believe this was a really good and productive debate. Just to give you the straw poll polls, it was a tie by our audience, a 4-4 vote. And the question of, is unskilled immigration beneficial to Americans? The majority answered no, it is not. 5-1. 5 being for no, 1 for yes. Again, thank you, gentlemen, for joining us for this debate. I would like to thank our live audience for also joining us. And I'd also like to send that invite out to you who's listening right now. You could find us at the Roundtable Discord server by Googling us. You could find our YouTube page, the Roundtable Discord, and you'll see that our Discord link is at the top of the page. So please stop on by. We want to hear from you. So that concludes our event, ladies and gentlemen. Please jump up to Roundtable 1 to continue the conversation or join the conversation that's already going on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you as well, my dude.